Hello, and welcome to Vices and Virtues, a series of animal stories for adults. I'm your storyteller, Matt Eddy. Vices and Virtues is a collection of fictional short stories written and read by me and can be listened to in any order. To find the other stories in this collection, please go to maddeddystories.com. There you will find other stories, upcoming podcasts, and events. Today's story is about two animals who call the woods their home. Please enjoy the bear and the moose. Of all the seasons, Bear loved spring, as the warmer weather brought thick green growth to the woods surrounding his home. His modest cabin consisted of a bedroom, a bathroom, a combined living and kitchen space, and a deck at the rear which overlooked an array of cedars, oaks, and pines. Each morning Bear would enjoy his bowl of porridge on the deck as the wind rustled the grandest trees and the sun warmed his round black nose. Except for the dirt cul-de-sac that led to the front yard, his home was enmeshed in wilderness. He was entirely alone, exactly the way Bear liked it. After breakfast, Bear would pull a beige fishing vest over his hulking shoulders and walk off his deck for a hike. Bear had an affinity for the woods. Treading carefully through the moss and rocks, he collected plant specimens as he went and stored them in the many pockets of his vest. Bear knew the woods intimately and would happily walk for hours with his vest stuffed with roots, flowers, leaves, and mushrooms. He knew which flowers were edible and to avoid the overturned oak where the poisonous death-cap mushrooms grew. When he would return to the cabin, Bear would lay his daily stash on the kitchen bench to study his findings before deciding what plants would be dried, chopped, and ground to make his homemade tea blend. The best plants would be bundled in twine and hung above the deck to dry. One morning, Bear sat on his deck, taking in the serenity while waiting for his tea to steep. As he reached for the teapot, a shrill beeping pulsed through the cabin. Reep, reep, reep. The noise echoed through the woods. Startled, Bear hurried through the cabin to the front windows. He rubbed his eyes at the sight of a white truck reversing up the cul-de-sac towards his home with a yellow excavator, the size of Bear's cabin, loaded on the back. A crew of groundhogs in fluorescent orange vests were yelling at one another. When the groundhogs put on hard hats, Bear dashed out of his cabin and headed toward the truck. "Excuse me," said Bear. "What's going on?" "Hey, pal, take it easy," replied a groundhog in a gruff voice. "We're building a house here. Go stick your nose in a pot of honey or something, won't ya?" The groundhog walked away, sipping coffee from his styrofoam cup. Bear was dumbfounded. The groundhog must have been mistaken. Yet dozens of groundhogs scurried about marking trees with spray paint and rolling around trundle wheels to survey the land directly next to Bear's cabin. Bear wondered how such a property could have been approved for construction without him knowing. One groundhog leaned against a tree, holding what looked like architectural plans. Bear was about to talk to him when he saw a plume of dirt coming down the cul-de-sac. It was a red convertible, with the top down, and a resounding bass boomed from its speakers. Bear shuffled back to his cabin and peered through his front windows. The car slid to a stop and out stepped Moose, wearing a pair of Ray-Bans and a sweater draped over his shoulders. The tall, brown animal's antlers towered into the sky. Moose started a conversation with the groundhog, sharing high fives and fist bumps. When Moose laughed at something the groundhog said, their gaze fell on Bear's cabin. Bear closed the curtains and hid behind them. "Hello there," called Moose, his voice as deep as a bassoon. Bear parted the curtains to see Moose stride through the front yard and knock on his door. Reluctantly, Bear opened it. "Hey, I'm Moose. Pleased to meet you, buddy." Moose grabbed Bear's paw, shaking it to and fro before strolling past Bear into his cabin. "What's going on out here?" replied Bear. The mere presence of Moose was a violation of his privacy, let alone having a stranger in his home. "You and I will be neighbors." Moose leaned his bulbous nose in to inspect the fireplace. "Neighbors?" cried Bear. "Of all the places in the woods, do you have to build right next to me?" Moose banged his antlers on the back door as he walked onto the deck. "Oh dear," said Moose as he ducked through the doorframe. "Sometimes I forget they're even there." Moose's antlers scratched the wooden doorframe, leaving gouge marks in the paint. Bear clenched his paws and followed after him. "Have you got any coffee or something?" asked Moose. "No," replied Bear. "Well," said Moose, eyeing Bear's cup and teapot, "I'll have whatever you're having." Bear was incredulous at the sheer single-mindedness of Moose. He wanted to toss him out, but he also had questions. How big would the house be? Would it be a small cabin like his? Would he be living there, or would this be his weekend getaway? Begrudgingly, Bear went into the kitchen for a second teacup and returned only to find Moose sitting in his favorite chair. Bear sat at the other end of the table and watched the excavator knock down trees and strip away the view to the side of his house. "So how big will this place be?" asked Bear as he poured Moose a cup of tea. "Oh, you don't need to worry about that," replied Moose. "By the way, this is delicious. What's in it?" Moose slurped at his tea. "It's my homemade blend from plants that grow in these woods," said Bear. "This one has herbs, a flower, spices, seeds, and mushrooms. Now, about this house of yours." "Mushrooms?" inquired Moose, peering into his teacup. "Oh, I've never heard of such a thing." "Oh, yes," said Bear. "They're very good for you. But back to your house." "Huh," replied Moose. "Could you, whip some of this up for me?" Moose wrapped his lips over the edge of the teacup and gulped the rest of his tea. "The house?" said Bear. "Oh, it's nothing special," said Moose. 2 stories, a double garage, and a back deck that would be... Moose looked around him. "At least 4 times the size of this one. You know, for entertaining." Bear felt his blood boiling. His cabin was his sanctuary. He had never had a neighbor and did not like the idea of a rude moose next door with a giant house blocking his view. This was his cul-de-sac and his woods. "Well, I'd best be on my way," announced Moose as he pushed himself back from the table. Bear had more questions, but Moose's antlers got stuck in a bundle of chamomile hanging overhead. "These things again," said Moose, shaking his head and scattering yellow and white flowers across the table. "Cheerio!" Moose called out as he tracked mud through the cabin and slammed the front door. Bear growled and slapped the table. The teacups jumped from their saucers and shattered on the deck, scattering shards of ceramic. With his cabin full of mud, his table covered in chamomile, and the deck covered in broken teacups, Bear was furious. Through spring and into summer, the noise of the worksite would wake Bear at dawn. At first it was the excavator knocking down trees and grinding them into pulp. Then a whirling cement mixer arrived to pump cement for the foundation. After that, the groundhogs erected a wooden frame with their pounding hammers and never-ending "Get-you! Get-you! Get-you!" of the nail guns. To escape the noise, Bear spent more time in the woods, but his thoughts constantly wandered back to Moose and what could be done about him. Returning home one day, Bear examined a shrub that had been crushed by excavator tracks. An idea came to him. He hurried inside, grabbed a notepad, and furiously began scribbling. He smiled at the genius of his plan as he wrote letters to the local mayor, town clerk, police chief, municipal judge, environmental commissioner, and each of the town council members. The woods were a delicate ecosystem that Bear knew better than anyone. Endangered plants in the woods were at risk of being destroyed by Moose's house. Such a disturbance would have unforeseen botanical consequences, and with an upcoming election, the mayor could not afford a public relations storm surrounding the protection of the woods. Bear would end Moose's construction and have his life go back to the way it was. A week later, assuming the officials had received his letters, Bear approached Moose at the front of the worksite. Moose was holding a clipboard, surveying the progress. "I think you've got a problem," called Bear. "Hi, Bear," replied Moose. "What problem?" "I heard that your house is violating environmental regulations," said Bear. "You should probably halt construction while it gets sorted." "Huh?" replied Moose. Then, after a moment, he chuckled. "Seems odd. The mayor is my sister-in-law. I'm a big contributor to her campaign, and my brother hasn't mentioned anything." Moose walked off towards the half-built house, whistling as he went. Bear hated how cocky Moose was, but still held out hope that his plan would work. Invoking the town's civic duty had been the only thing Bear could think of to get rid of Moose without having to forcibly remove him or tear down the building himself. When Bear's mail finally arrived, he sat on his deck and tore open each envelope stamped with the town's official's crest. Each response was the same. "We thank you for your letter and appreciate your concern, but we have decided to take no action concerning the matter." Bear scrunched up the letters and bellowed a deep, guttural growl. What was once a scenic view of the woods beside him was now a sweeping view of Moose's half-built house and backyard. As fall arrived, Bear was somewhat relieved to see the groundhogs disappear and the painters arrive to apply the finishing touches. But then Moose brought in more groundhogs to build a fence around his backyard, install a jacuzzi, and erect a gazebo. Moose moved into his new home, seemingly still oblivious to how Bear felt about the situation. Moose would wave when he was mowing his lawn. Moose would ask about getting some of Bear's tea. Moose would try and start conversations whenever Bear would come and go from the woods. Bear started having daydreams of hurting Moose. Bear might push him or punch him if the opportunity arose. When Bear brought down his sharpest kitchen knife on a bouquet of crisp herbs from the woods, he'd picture Moose's hoof under the blade instead. Bear let his dark fantasies grow more sinister until he started seriously contemplating how he could get rid of Moose and destroy the house. On the morning the gazebo was complete, Bear discovered an envelope slipped under his front door. When he turned it over, he saw that it had been closed with a red wax seal of 2 antlers and signed by Moose. Bear threw it out without opening it. He wanted nothing to do with Moose. That night, Bear placed a hot water bottle under his quilt and got into bed. As soon as he drifted off to sleep, a saxophone shrieked outside his cabin. A drum kicked in, and more instruments screeched. Bear put his paws over his ears, but it did nothing. He roared angrily before getting out of bed and rushing to the kitchen window. A band blared from the gazebo, and a crowd of animals danced. At the center was Moose in a velvet suit with trinkets hanging from the points of his antlers. He knocked his knees together as his jacket flapped wildly, jitterbugging around the dance floor. Bear pulled on his bathrobe and marched over to Moose's house. When he rang the doorbell, a deer dressed in a white button-down shirt and blue chinos opened the door. "Hey, man," said the deer, sipping a red Solo cup. "Come on in and help yourself. We've got beer, wine, cocktails, whatever." Bear wanted to wrench the antlers out of the deer's head. "Hey, Bear!" called Moose. He strolled up behind the deer and nudged him aside. "I'm so glad you got my invite. Come on in." Moose took a sip from his champagne flute. "What's this?" said Bear, pointing his claw toward the party. "Well, like it said in the invite," replied Moose. "We're having a housewarming shindig. I'll grab you a drink. Let me guess, you're a margarita on the rocks, salt on the rim kind of guy." Moose reached for Bear's shoulder, but Bear pulled away. The champagne flute toppled, spilling the champagne down the front of Bear's bathrobe. Moose and Bear stared at each other. "Ah, well, plenty more where that came from," chortled Moose. Bear gnashed his teeth and flashed his claws. He straightened his back and stood tall, ready to attack. Moose didn't notice as he turned and headed back into the party. Bear's body tensed, his muscles coiled, ready to explode. He'd jam his claws through Moose's ribs and pull apart his chest cavity with a crack. As Bear stood in the doorway fuming, the deer reappeared. "Sorry, dude," said the deer as he closed the door on Bear. "It's cold out there." Standing in the dark, Bear knew there would be no way he would be able to attack Moose without others intervening. He returned to his cabin, removed his bathrobe, rinsed it in the sink, and got in the shower. As the water streamed through his coarse fur, he swore that tomorrow he would find a way to be rid of Moose. The next day when he woke, Bear pulled on his fishing vest and walked into the woods. Passing the upended oak, he had an idea. He got down on all fours and sniffed the soil until he spotted the death-cap mushrooms. A small amount would be enough to kill an animal, even one the size of Moose. Bear pulled the mushrooms from the dirt and placed them in his pockets. When Bear returned to his cabin, he mixed a batch of his tea while the death-cap mushrooms dried in the oven. When it was ready, he moved the contents of the mixing bowl to a cellophane bag, added the mushrooms, shook the contents, and tied a bow of twine at the top. The mushroom would give all the symptoms of food poisoning while causing a lethal amount of kidney and liver damage. It was perfect. That afternoon, Bear rang the doorbell of Moose's house with his fishing vest still on. The cellophane bag looked identical to his regular batch. Moose opened the door, rubbing his eyes. He wore a tracksuit and a few trinkets still hung from his antlers. "Bear?" said Moose. "What time is it? Whew! What a party! Did you—" "Moose," Bear cut him off. "I want to apologize. I bought you a gift." Bear held out the tea. "Apologize?" said Moose. "Oh, your tea." Bear handed over the bag and left before Moose could respond. In his cabin, Bear cleaned up where he had made the tea, gazing out the kitchen window. Streamers blew in the breeze from the gazebo. Balloons flew at half-mast as they lost their helium, and plastic cups were strewn around the yard. Bear had an uninterrupted view across Moose's kitchen and living room area. He would watch Moose's demise from here. But what if he didn't die? Bear thought to himself. Moose might not drink the tea, or he might get sick and recover, or his body would shut down. Moose would go into a coma, pass out, or fall into a deep sleep. Then what? Moose was popular, he had friends, they would come for him. Bear paced around his cabin trying to think. Between his anger and the excitement of his idea, he hadn't thoroughly considered the consequences. Even if Moose did die, there would be an autopsy. The body would link him back to Bear. The medical examiner would detect the poison, the police would locate the tea, and it would all connect back to Bear, his tea, his cellophane bag, and his twine. He would have to get rid of the body. Once Moose was asleep or dead, he would start a fire. Burning down the house meant that there would be no Moose for an autopsy, no house next door, and investigators would conclude that it had been an accident. Bear stayed close to the kitchen window and watched Moose turn on the television, make his meals, and set about his day. Importantly, Moose was drinking from a mug. As darkness engulfed the woods, Bear waited at the kitchen window. Moose lay on his couch, with only the television illuminating the living room. Bear crept out to the side of Moose's house and walked up to the back. The sliding doors were unlocked. Bear made his way into the house, carefully tiptoeing across the floorboards. A collection of mugs were on the coffee table next to a teapot. Moose must have drunk 6 cups of the deadly brew. Moose was lying on the couch, drooling on a pillow. Bear held up his paw and could feel Moose's faint breathing. His black, deep nostrils were moist. The rest of his face was pale. Bear walked to the kitchen, sloshed an entire bottle of cooking oil into a frying pan, placed it on the stove, and twisted the knob to high. The flames licked up the side of the pan, and the oil smoked and popped. Bear turned back to the couch. Moose hadn't moved. Bear grabbed the dish towels hanging on the oven and placed them around the stovetop. They started to smoke and caught fire. As Bear returned through the sliding doors, the oil and towels combusted, spitting fiery oil across the wooden bench tops. Bear scampered back to his cabin. The fire burst through Moose's kitchen window and danced across the house, blistering paintwork and shattering glass as it went. As the minutes passed, Bear sat in his living room, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he relaxed into his chair. He would no longer have to put up with Moose. Then he heard the wailing. It was the unmistakable sound of Moose howling for his life. The fire cackled as it consumed the house, but the screaming persisted. As soon as one scream ended, another began. Bear gripped the edges of his chair. The foul scent of the burning house permeated into the cabin. Bear closed his eyes and hoped the screaming would stop. In the darkness of his eyelids, Bear saw Moose jolting awake to the flames surrounding him, the fire burning his nostrils, scorching his fur, and blinding his eyes. The howls were more torturous than any of Moose's annoyances. Moose was being burnt alive. What have I done? Thought Bear. For all the commotion that Moose had caused, he didn't deserve to die like this. Bear bolted from his cabin and opened Moose's sliding back doors. Smoke roiled out. Bear covered his eyes and walked towards the couch. Moose wasn't there. Bear proceeded deeper inside. "Moose!" Bear yelled. There was no reply. He frantically searched, his fur singed by fire. It was difficult to see through the heavy smoke. Flames and shadows pranced around him. Each time he thought he caught a glimpse of Moose's body, it disappeared into the inferno. The screaming stopped. Bear panicked as he wondered where Moose might have collapsed. "Moose!" Bear yelled again, coughing as his throat filled with smoke. A fire truck soon came screaming down the cul-de-sac to extinguish the fire. By the time they were done battling the blaze, the roof had collapsed and only the charred walls remained. The firefighters found Moose sitting in the dirt. An ambulance arrived and took him to the hospital. Blood tests detected the poison, which the doctors flushed out of his system. They treated him for minor burns and smoke inhalation and told him he was lucky to be alive. He steadily improved. While he lay in the hospital bed, the local fire chief, a Dalmatian, came and spoke with him. "Do you live with a bear?" asked the Dalmatian. No, replied Moose, shaking his head. "Bear lives next door. He's a good guy. Tries to keep to himself." "I'm sorry, but we found the remains of a bear amongst the rubble," explained the Dalmatian. "We'll need to do a formal identification, but..." The fire chief trailed off. "My God," whimpered Moose. "Poor bear. Such a good friend. He must have tried to save me." The Bear and the Moose was edited by Sylvia Schwartz and Todd Green. You can find the Vices and Virtues collection on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. To join the mailing list and receive updates on Matt Eddy stories, please go to matteddystories.com. You can follow me on Instagram at matteddystories. For literary agent inquiries, speaking engagement requests, or publicity inquiries, please email admin@matteddystories.com. This story was dedicated to Lockie and brought to you by Hudson Valley Podcasting.